Today, I'd argue that Intel's Celeron brand has fallen into near irrelevancy. The latest Celeron CPUs came out over 2 years ago, and they hardly ever get brought up in discussion. I feel like still just even 7 or 8 years ago, they were still at least the bad, cheap option that people would make fun of for being slow, and often not really being a great value. Nowadays, it's basically just forgotten. But I can't really say this is all that unexpected. For the past 20 plus years, the Celeron has just not been exciting or really anything special. The early and mid-2000s with the NetBurst Celeron really did a lot of damage to the Celeron brand name. They were hot, slow, and I don't think it ever totally recovered from that reputation. While there were some after the NetBurst Celerons that weren't too bad, it was never able to recapture the glory of the late 90s Celeron. That's right, at one time the Celeron was good value, beloved by enthusiasts, and were incredibly overclockable. So it's the mid-90s, and Intel didn't really have dedicated branding or a specific lineup for lower-end processors. They pretty much just had clock speed variation, and that was kind of it. After they moved to slot 1, their older Pentium offerings on socket 7 kind of became their low-end lineup, but Intel really wanted to move away from socket 7 since, AMD and other competitors were actively using this, and they really wanted to distance themselves from, anything that their competitors were using. But their only offerings on slot 1 was the Pentium 2, so they would need to come up with some sort of new low-end offering for the slot 1 platform. So in 1998, Intel launched the new Celeron brand, with the launch of the 266 MHz Celeron using the Covington core. I don't have one of these to show you. In fact, I don't have any actual slot 1 Celerons. A little later on, they also released a 300 MHz variant. These early Covington Celerons were... They weren't bad, they just weren't lighting the world on fire. These Celerons weren't all too dissimilar from their full-fat Pentium 2 brothers. However, in order for Intel to get the prices down on these, they needed to cut the L2 cache out. Oh yeah, and not just part of the L2 cache, they got rid of all of it. Naturally, this decreased performance quite significantly and made them cheaper to produce, which is what Intel was aiming for. These early Celerons, however, were not received all too well. While in gaming they didn't do too badly, in more business-focused applications they really struggled. The lack of L2 cache was mainly to blame for this, and it hurt the Celeron's reputation with business customers. Obviously, Intel just couldn't keep selling a processor with no L2 cache forever. So soon after, actually quite soon after, by only like a few months actually, Intel released the Celeron 300A with the Mendocino core. I always thought they were launched further apart, but nope, I guess Intel was already on top of the problem. The Mendocino core now featured 128K of L2 cache, a quarter of what the Pentium 2s had. This sounds great, and it was, but it was even better for many more reasons. The first of these again has to do with the L2 cache. See, on Pentium 2s and the early Katmai Pentium 3s, the L2 cache is not actually in the CPU die itself, and this is actually the reason why Intel moved to this slot kind of cartridge format, was so that way they could have the cache be external and just soldered to a PCB next to the CPU die. This meant the cache could be a lot faster than the older socket 7 method of having the L2 cache be on the motherboard, and this was also significantly cheaper than how they were manufacturing the Pentium Pros, which had the L2 cache and the CPU die on the same package. They weren't in the same die, but they were on the same package, and that greatly complicated manufacturing costs, and the yields also weren't too great using that method. But now with the Mendocino core, Intel opted to integrate the L2 cache into the CPU die itself. Considering they were now on a new 250nm node, time had passed and they had learned how to, get better at manufacturing CPUs, as that sort of thing tends to go. They were able to successfully integrate the 128K of L2 cache into the CPU die, and it didn't end up being too expensive. So this worked out quite well for Intel, but it also worked out very well for the consumer. See, on the Pentium 2s, the external L2 cache is actually only running at half of the clock speed that the CPU die itself is running at. So on a 300 MHz Pentium 2, the L2 cache is only running at 150 MHz. On a 450 MHz Pentium 2, the L2 cache only runs at 225 MHz, and so on and so forth with every clock speed version of the Pentium 2, and again, those early Katmai Pentium 3s. However, because the L2 cache is on die with Mendocino, it actually runs at the full core speed of the CPU. So on a 300 MHz Celeron, the L2 cache runs at 300 MHz. So despite being smaller, the L2 cache is actually significantly faster than it is on a Pentium 2. And this really helped the performance loss caused by having a smaller L2 cache, especially in tasks like gaming. All of this is great, but it gets even better. Around this time, Intel was moving the Pentium 2s to a new 100 MHz frontside bus, instead of the older 66 MHz bus that they had been using for years at that point. However, in order for Intel to increase compatibility, make them more compatible with more motherboards, they opted to still run these at the slower 66 MHz bus, and that also helped them from, eating into the Pentium 2s too much. And honestly, this was a pretty reasonable solution. I don't think anyone really expected Intel to, suddenly try to make these a super high-end processor. But what if you could? See, if you happen to have a motherboard capable of, increasing the front side bus past 66 MHz, say to the 100 MHz supported by the newer Pentium 2s, you could unlock the Mendocino's party trick, their insane overclocking ability. While the multiplier was locked on the Celeron, Intel couldn't do anything to stop you from increasing the front side bus, and the Mendocino loved to clock. The original 300A, which, again, I don't have here to show you, again, it kind of looks like this, just with no L2 cache. It kind of looks like that. But the original 300A had an incredibly high overclock success rate. A very large majority of them could run with a 100 MHz bus, often on stock voltage. The 300A had a 4.5x multiplier, so with a 100 MHz bus, they ran at 450 MHz, and that's a pretty good overclock. This brought about a huge performance increase basically for free, and it instantly became a budget king. The overclock was so good, coupled with the faster L2 cache, meant that oftentimes the Celeron was just as fast, if not faster, than Intel's top-tier Pentium 2s, for a fraction of the price. Again, I don't have a 300A in any capacity, slot 1 or socket 370, because they are fairly sought after for pretty obvious reason. But thankfully, Intel made many more Mendocino Celerons, which are thankfully much easier to find and are cheaper. So let's take a look at the two examples of the Mendocino Celeron we're going to be looking at today. Now, I am going to be using a slot 1 test system, so I will be using a slot kit adapter. This adapts a socket 370 CPU to a slot 1 cartridge design, and this works pretty well. It's worth noting that Intel released the Mendocino Celeron on both slot 1 and socket 370 kind of at the same time. In fact, socket 370 was actually created for these low-end Celerons. 370 was originally a low-end platform that later on Intel kind of adapted into the higher-end platform that was used on like the Coppermine and the Tualatin Pentium 3s. But yeah, all the way up to 433 MHz, these both got a slot 1 and a socket 370 version. This is a 366 MHz Celeron, and the code on that is SL36C. So 366 MHz chip, basically the exact same setup that I just described for the 300A. 128K L2 cache running at the full core speed, and looking at some of Intel's press releases at the time, this, for the slot 1 version at least, would have launched for around $130, and I think for the socket 370 version it was around $120. I think that might have been for 1,000 unit quantities, so I'm not exactly sure how much an individual one would have cost if you bought it straight from Intel, but I guess if you bought perhaps a tray CPU, you could get it for, I imagine, cheaper without all the packaging and whatnot. And this 366 MHz chip actually launched in very early 1999 instead of kind of mid 98 like the 300A did. And then a couple months later, Intel released this. This is a 433 megahertz. This is SL3DA. It's basically identical to the other chip. In fact, I think they even run at the exact same voltage of like 2 volts. But really there's two main distinguishing factors here. This one launched closer to $170, $180. Again, this one was between $120 and $130. This one launched a couple months after the 366. And the other thing is their multiplier setting. Now this becomes a big factor when deciding what kind of Mendocino Celeron to get. If you don't plan on overclocking, then yeah, you should probably just go for the, the typical advice you'd think of, go for the highest clocked one and just use that. But if you plan on overclocking, you have to contend with that locked multiplier, and that can cause a lot of issues if you go with a higher factory clocked one. See, this one has a 5.5x multiplier, meaning if we ran it with a 100 megahertz bus, we're looking at a 550 megahertz CPU. The 433 has a 6.5x multiplier, so that would be 650 megahertz. Now, these Mendocino Celerons, from everything I've read, they really start topping out at 600. It's really hard to get one of these to run faster than 600 megahertz. So while they do have great overclocking potential, that is kind of like a hard brick wall that's really hard to get past. So often going with a faster one was not always the best option, because a lot of times you'd have to run with a slower front side bus, and that introduces issues with like dividers and whatnot, and you gotta, it's a little not as easy to deal with. So oftentimes going with a slower chip and overclocking it, not only it saved you money, but you could probably get better overclocking results out of it as well. And this is going to be our test platform for today. This is my Asus P3BF. It's one of the only functional slot 1 motherboards I have, and the only one with the 440BX chipset. Probably one of Intel's best chipsets, very reliable, very stable. Also my first time really getting to use it in any extensive capacity, and I quite like it. We have a fairly simple allotment of stuff going on here. We have our slot kit that our Celerons are going to be using. The RAM is just the RAM that came with this board when I got it. Just a single stick of Infineon 256 megabyte PC 133 RAM. It says CL3, but it can actually run at CL2 at 100 megahertz FSB and lower, so that's quite nice. This is definitely more RAM than the average person who had a Celeron would have been using with their system, but 128 megabytes or even 64 would be more realistic, but I don't care. Got a Linksys Ethernet card for, frankly, no real reason. I didn't end up using it at all, but it's there. We've got a Sound Blaster Live, just because that was convenient and easy to use for me. And then we have a 3DFX Voodoo 3 3000. I chose the Voodoo 3 because, frankly, it should be more than fast enough for any of the CPUs that we're going to be testing today. And it's just really easy to get set up and working, and who doesn't love using a Voodoo card? And then I'm just using an SD card adapter with a 64 gigabyte SanDisk card as our hard drive. As for the software, we're running pretty much just plain stock Windows 98 SE. I don't think I installed any updates or anything. Running the latest official Voodoo 3 driver, and I think Intel chipset drivers are 3.2 from like 2001 or thereabouts. Latest official VXD driver for the Sound Blaster. And DirectX version, I think, is 7. I don't think I updated it past DX7. I'll double check. I'll put a thing up on the screen if it is something different. All right, so I have the system here set up on my test station, and if we turn this on here, I have the 366 megahertz Celeron to start with. Now, one of the nice things about this Asus P3BF is that it actually has a quite relatively new feature for the time. That's being able to set all of the CPU settings in the BIOS. There are dip switches on the motherboard, which is even more convenient than jumpers, but even more convenient is just being able to do it in the BIOS. So I've set the jumpers to enable the BIOS control, and that makes overclocking so much easier. And the other thing I love about this BIOS is it just pops up right away anytime you put in a new CPU. They knew what you were doing. Yeah, do you want to run with the 66 megahertz bus or the 100? Well, obviously we want to do the 100, and look at that. It just automatically sets it right there for you. No fuss, no worry. But you can go to manual. Obviously we can't adjust the multiplier because that's locked in the CPU. Can't even lower it. These were locked both ways, but we actually have quite a number of settings, including all the way up to 133. So if we wanted to, we could run high-end Coppermine CPUs on this. We'll actually even go up to 150. That's pretty impressive for a slot 1 board. I don't know how stable that would actually be with any chips, but you could do it. And if you're wondering what this is the PCI clock. PCI is supposed to run at 33 megahertz, so typically you want a setting that's relatively close to 33, so you hopefully don't run into weird instabilities like this 133 option at 44. Yeah, that's probably pushing it. So a lot of times it'd probably be smarter to go with the 133 with the normal PCI divider. Clocking the PCI bus higher does mean it could have better performance for certain devices, but again, you can end up with all sorts of weird compatibility issues, so usually it's not totally worth it unless you really know what you're doing. You can also adjust core voltage here. We can go all the way up to 2.4, which I'm pretty sure would probably cook the CPU and probably not very long at all. And we basically got all the other, you know, stuff. These are the RAM settings if you care, and I just have it set here for by the SPD, and it's actually running at a CL2. This board's also running on the latest BIOS, so in case you're wondering, we go ahead here into CPU-Z, the Windows 9X version, and yeah, it shows up still 366, but we are running at 550 megahertz. So yeah, quite impressive, and at least from an initial first glance here, seems to be stable. But yeah, if you had a nicer motherboard like this, again, you can do it all through the BIOS. Makes it very easy to tweak and configure your settings. All right, well, I've gone ahead and done some testing, and these are the overclocking results I've been able to get out of these. For the 366 megahertz Celeron, I was very pleasantly surprised. It was able to run at a 100 megahertz frontside bus, no issues. It was incredibly stable at stock voltage. Again, the 300A is the one that's always talked about as being, you know, the really stable overclock one, and kind of as you go up in clock speed, it becomes a lot, you know, more iffy. You're taking more of a gamble whether or not it can actually run at a 100 megahertz bus. But this one seems to be a pretty good piece of silicon. So yeah, going from 366 megahertz to 550, that's absolutely gonna blow a Pentium 2 out of the water, at least if my my theories are correct. And it might even pose a pretty good challenge against a ACME Pentium 3. The 433 megahertz one was definitely a little bit more disappointing. I could not get this to even boot with a 100 megahertz bus. It would not post at all. I think I went all the way up to 2.3 volts, which absolutely would have fried this thing if I ran it for any significant period of time. But yeah, even at that high of voltage, it refused to boot. So yeah, that higher multiplier is actually really working against this CPU's favor. So the next highest frontside bus option I had was 83 megahertz, and that's quite a bit slower than a 100 megahertz bus. But coupled with the 6.5x multiplier, that gave us around a 541 megahertz overclock. So actually really similar and comparable to the 366. But again, it's about 10 megahertz slower, and it's running with a slower bus. But yeah, at least from my initial testing, your best bet if you're looking to get one of these to overclock, probably stick to 366 or lower, and would have been your best option at the time anyways, because again, these were cheaper than the higher tier ones, and they usually overclocked better. Now, of course, we could just compare them against each other, but that's really no fun. So we're going to be comparing it against the Pentium 2 that I've been waving around in your face and not cleaning the paste off of. So this is a 400 megahertz Pentium 2 with, you know, 512K of L2 cache, and it was fabbed in Ireland. That's so cool. Also, it's worth noting, because I know someone's going to bring it up, the half-speed L2 cache thing is only an issue on the consumer Pentium 2s. The Pentium 2 Xeons, I believe the L2 cache actually runs at the full core speed, so that's just worth keeping in mind. But we're looking at this through the lens of, you know, consumer CPUs, not, you know, server and workstation Xeon CPUs. And then the real challenge for these CPUs to go up against, this is one of the best ACME Pentium 3s that Intel released. This is a 600 megahertz ACME Pentium 3. Supposedly, I've seen that there is a a 600 megahertz one that runs with a 133 megahertz bus. And that supposedly is a ACME core. I don't know if that one ever actually released. It kind of seems more like an engineering sample kind of thing to me. But according to CPU World, it does exist. These early ACME Pentium 3s really are extremely similar to the older Deschutes Pentium 2s. They were built on the same 250 nanometer node. They have the same L2 cache, same speed configuration, run at nearly the same core voltage. Really, the only benefit that the Pentium 3 has going for it is that it has SSE instructions. So it'll be curious to see if SSE really helps this propel way beyond the Celerons, or if it's going to be a pretty close fight. Again, only 50 megahertz between these two. That's going to be quite an interesting battle, I think. And now for the moment that we've all been waiting for, the benchmarks. I was originally going to do the stock benchmarks first, go through all of those, then go through the overclocked benchmarks. Frankly, that took way too long, so we're just going to take a look at all of them now, and you can just pause the video and examine them how you see fit. But some initial things that I think are worth looking at is the Celeron 433 at stock speeds versus the Pentium 2. In most of the benchmarks that we'll see here, the race between these is very close. In fact, the Celeron actually beats the Pentium 2 in quite a few benchmarks, which I think is very interesting. I would have thought, even with the slight clock speed advantage the Celeron has, that it would still lose to the Pentium 2, but that's not the case in most of these. Also, the stock 366 Celeron is worth keeping an eye on because, again, for the price that it was, and considering it did launch before the Celeron 433, so closer to the Pentium 2, the gap between the 366 and the Pentium 2 isn't that big sometimes, and I don't know, I think it's quite fascinating. Everyone always talks about these CPUs as being, the amazing overclockers they are, rightfully so, but at stock speeds, they're actually not bad. I kind of thought they'd be worse than this, but no. And of course, the Pentium 3 is going to blow away all of the stock speed benchmarks. It has such a huge clock speed advantage. It also has SSE. That's no real surprise there. The only case where the Pentium 3 is going to actually matter for the comparison is with the overclocked Celerons, because the clock speeds are actually close to each other. So there we go. That's my little thing aside. Keep that kind of stuff in mind as you're looking at these graphs. Pause the video, take a look at them all you like, and let's get into this. So looking at CPU-Z, this is the Windows 9 X version. CPU-Z is not a very accurate or great benchmark, really, in my experience, but I figured I'd just throw it in because it was easy to run. We can see the overclocked Celerons are doing very well. In fact, they're kind of about the margin I would expect for being, about 50 megahertz slower than the Pentium 3. I think CPU-Z is a lot more heavily dependent on just the clock speed than it really is like cache or anything necessarily like that. But yeah, the overclocked Celerons are doing very well. The 541 megahertz Celeron is, again, a little bit behind the 550, slower bus and all that, as to be expected. And we also have the floating point benchmarks there, and there doesn't really seem to be really a difference. None of the CPU's floating point units seems to be dramatically better than the other, except maybe the Pentium 3 is doing a little better. Looking at Cinebench 2000, this really surprised me. The 550 Celeron is, technically speaking, beating the 600 megahertz Pentium 3. That is crazy. Now, this is completely within margin of error, so in my opinion, these are dead equal. But the fact that a cheap $130 Celeron, just overclocked, is able to match the 600 megahertz ACME Pentium 3. This was, again, one of the best CPUs you could have gotten in, for most of 1999. That is fantastic. The 541 is definitely showing its weakness more here. That 83 megahertz bus is really not helping it. It is still beating all the stock clocked results as you would expect, but yeah. Also, I just want to note the 433 is beating the Pentium 2 by a quite large margin. I really don't know how it's pulling that off, but it is somehow. In Cinebench 2003, we can see the Pentium 3 is pulling ahead of the Celerons, probably due to SSE. I think by this point, they would have added that to Cinebench. But still, it's not a huge gap, honestly. A little bit more than just, you know, what you'd expect from a 50 megahertz clock speed, you know, advantage over the Celeron, but that's not bad. Again, the price. It all comes down to the price. That's really impressive. 3D Mark 99, the Pentium 3 is extremely strong in this benchmark, and that's because 3D Mark uses SSE. It flat out, it shows up and it detects it as Pentium 3 optimizations. I could have turned those off, but that doesn't make any sense. Why would I do that? So yeah, the Pentium 3 is dominating here, especially in the dedicated CPU score. It is getting it is dangerously close to being double the 550 megahertz Celeron in the dedicated CPU score. And that's all from just SSE. Now, again, this is 3D Mark, so these benchmarks aren't totally indicative of real-world performance. These are all synthetic benchmarks, but it's still interesting to look at. With that said, the 550, the 541, they're not doing too bad. You know, those scores are reasonably decent, I'd say. It also is worth noting that for the 3D Mark scores, both 99 and 2000, I left them at their stock resolutions and settings, so that's 800 by 600 for 99, 1024 by 768 for 2000. That definitely is getting a little bit taxing on the Voodoo 3, especially in 2000, but the reason I left it at the default settings is that you can compare the scores more easily to your own machines and your own testing. That way nobody gets confused, because at least to my knowledge, if you mess around with the resolution in 3D Mark, it does affect how the score is calculated. I think, at least. If that's wrong, let me know, but that's to my knowledge what it is. But I just did that for ease of comparison and to reduce any confusion. So 3D Mark 2000, again, the Pentium 3 is really winning with SSE instructions. That's not really surprising at all. Thankfully, though, a lot of games didn't really start taking advantage of SSE, I think, until around maybe 2000. More likely, I think 2001 and later is when it really started picking up. So 3D Mark is just being overly kind to the Pentium 3 here. But the Celerons are doing quite well. They're both beating the Pentium 2 quite easily. And it's definitely not a bad score for the time. And we also have the dedicated CPU score, kind of the same story. This is the Quake 2 average FPS. We can see we've got 3 different resolutions here. OpenGL 800 by 600, and running in software mode 320 by 240 and 640 by 480. I kind of expected the Celeron 550 to beat the Pentium 3 in these, but despite Quake 2 not having any SSE optimizations at all, SSE didn't even exist yet, the Pentium 3 is still beating the 550 Celeron in all of the tests here. That might just be Quake 2 prefers clock speed, or it just likes more cache, not really sure, but the Celerons are still performing quite well. Quake 3 average FPS, this was ran at 800 by 600, high settings. I kind of messed around with the settings, and the settings didn't really seem to make much of a difference in performance, so I just left it at high. I think the settings have more of an impact on the GPU than they do on the CPU. The Pentium 3, again, does have a definitely noticeable lead, 5 FPS lead over the 550 Celeron, but it's not doing bad. That's pretty respectable, I think. And again, just like the performance gain you get out of these from overclocking, like it's almost 20 FPS faster on the 550 than it is to the stock Celeron at 366. That is a huge performance gain that we've seen in all of the tests, and I would hope so considering it's running significantly faster. Unreal Tournament 99, again 800 by 600. The settings didn't really seem to make a huge difference on the CPU performance. I used the UT Bench demo file that I use for all of my UT99 benchmarks because it's extremely taxing on the CPU. There's tons of bots, there's lots of crazy stuff going on, so this is a really good CPU stressor. Pentium 3 is again still in the lead a little bit, but the Celerons are not far behind. The 550 is only 2 FPS slower. Would you notice that? Maybe a little bit, but again, is the Pentium 3 worth the hundreds of extra dollars you would have spent on it at the time? I don't know. And looking at expendable, this is the demo version of Expendable. I've never really messed around with this game before. I don't know if the demo version is different than the retail in terms of the benchmark and whatnot. Again, 800 by 600 high settings. I did not know this benchmark ran for over 5 minutes. I didn't know that. I don't know why it runs so long, but it does. Anyways, the Pentium 3 here, I think, has the biggest lead in an actual game over the Celerons, but that is definitely a noticeable lead. You would notice that in-game, you would feel it. The Celerons still aren't doing too bad. The overclocked Celerons lead over the Pentium 2, actually, it's still there, but it's not quite as noticeable as it was in a lot of other of the benchmarks, so I think Expendable kind of prefers the larger cache that the Pentium 2 and 3 have to offer, but that's just kind of my speculation. Anyways, overall, these benchmarks have been extremely impressive for the Celerons. They haven't been outright winning over the Pentium 3, but they've been very close in a lot of the benchmarks, and that is really impressive. So in conclusion, these Mendocino Celerons were fantastic. The 366 being able to so easily overclock, and just, it didn't fight me at all. It went straight to 550, no extra voltage, no nothing, and you get such a massive performance improvement out of it. Considering how much cheaper this would have been a no-brainer back in the day. Of course, these couldn't clock quite as reliably as the 300A. The 300A had like a very high success rate. These, I don't really know what the success rate on these were, but as we can definitely see, success rate was probably higher than the 433. I don't think the 433 was completely useless back in the day. Again, if you had an older motherboard that only supported 66 megahertz processors, we saw that even at stock, it didn't perform terribly. It was about on par with the 400 megahertz Pentium 2 in most cases, and that's not too bad. You know, it did come out like several months after the 400 megahertz Pentium 2, but that's besides the point. But even if you did buy one of these and you still overclocked it, if you could only run it at 83 megahertz bus, it still performed pretty well. Just, I think for the money, the 366 was by far the safer investment. It was cheaper, and not to mention had probably a higher overclock success rate. And even if you couldn't get this to overclock to 550 reliably, well, I know for the 300A, I don't know if this was very common for these later chips, but for the 300A, you could actually buy from vendors CPUs that had already been validated to be, you know, perfect overclockers, and I don't know if that existed for these later ones, but it wouldn't surprise me if it didn't. You know, you pay a little bit extra, but, you know, you get one that for sure can overclock to, you know, 550 just how you want it. I think that would be worth the money. I don't know what they would have charged, maybe 20 bucks extra. I don't really know. Of course, some people just returned the chips anyways. That was, I think, easier to do back then. Nowadays, I think it's a little harder to get stores to accept returns on that kind of thing, but I think back then maybe there was a little bit more flexibility when it came to that. So yeah, back in the day, either one of these would have been pretty good options. I don't think I would have been terribly upset picking either, just obviously the 366 is by far the smarter option to go with. But what about today? Everyone that's building slot 1 systems almost always goes for a Pentium 2 or a Pentium 3, and well, frankly, I can understand why. I mean, you can afford those now, you know. A higher-end Pentium 2 goes for, what, under 30 bucks? A higher-end Pentium 3, that definitely costs more. But with a slot kit, you can easily fix that. So do these even really have a place in modern retro PC gaming? I think so. If you were going for that high-end Pentium 2, kind of lower, mid-range Pentium 3 kind of system, you weren't like super focused on raw speed and whatnot. You just, you know, you really want like a 1999 kind of system. You don't want to go later or something like that. I don't see why not to go with this. And honestly, even if you don't care about the specific era, I think it still might be worth going with one of these, because just being able to overclock it is just fun. It's just fun to say that, yeah, I have an overclocked 98 machine with a Celeron that beats the pants of any Pentium 2. And in terms of pricing, the slot 1 version of the Celeron 366 is It's more than the Socket 370 version, but not by a lot. You could probably get it for, I think, about 20 bucks, maybe a little bit less from what I was looking at on eBay. And honestly, for that price, I mean, that's about, again, what you'd pay for, you know, a reasonably high-end Pentium 2, or even like, you know, maybe a 450, 500 megahertz Pentium 3. The 600 megahertz Katmai Pentium 3 that I have is actually not super common. I know a lot of people probably used these in their gaming systems back in the day. These were pretty popular amongst just general PC, you know, OEM kind of stuff because they were cheap and, you know, they had the Intel brand, but, you know, they were actually pretty good. Now, a lot of times the actual computers these were in were not amazing, but if you were an enthusiast and you knew what you were doing, these were fantastic. You just had to pair them with a decent motherboard and other decent hardware to be able to, you know, really get the most out of these. And I get that everyone wants to do the, you know, super high-end build that they didn't get to have back in the day, but honestly, if you're not really attached nostalgically to this time period and you're just kind of looking for something fun to build, absolutely, I can recommend the Mendocino Celerons. I would probably just stay below 400 megahertz. That would just be my recommendation. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully it wasn't too long and rambly. Hopefully it isn't like that much longer than the Pentium 4 video.
I have some bad news.